Welcome to another episode of Tech Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day, here with my colleague Sumantra Mitra, and with a very special guest, Kelly Vlahos, host of the Trip the Beltway Fantastic podcast and the editorial director at Responsible Statecraft. That's the online magazine of the Quincy Institute, and everyone interested in foreign policy restraint should read it every day. It's one of the first websites I check every morning when I'm looking for news and political analysis. Today we'll be talking about the Israel-Iran war. We are recording on Monday, June 16th, a little after 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. I need to kind of timestamp this because things are, developing rapidly. Early Friday morning, Israel launched a surprise attack against Iran. The Iranian government was clearly caught off guard. Israel's multi-pronged attack took out senior military leaders and nuclear scientists, damaged nuclear facilities, although it seems like Iran's nuclear program is basically still intact, and even targeted Iran's chief negotiator on the U.S.-Iran talks. Since then, Israel and Iran have been exchanging missile strikes. Israel's air defense systems are excellent, but some ballistic missiles launched by Iran are hitting their targets, causing damage in Tel Aviv and other cities. Israel and its American supporters clearly want the U.S. to get involved to take out the nuclear facility at Fordow, which is buried basically in a mountain and deep underground, so it requires these 30,000-pound bunker busters to take out, which the U.S. possesses, and we possess the B-2 bombers, but Israel does not. And they also seem to want the U.S. to take out the Iranian regime in general. Iran is the chief adversary of Israel in the region. So, of course, President Donald Trump had been pursuing nuclear negotiations with Iran. It's one reason this surprise attack caught the Iranians off guard, and striking a nuclear deal had seemingly been a top foreign policy priority of the Trump administration. At least I thought it was. So, Kelly, my first question to you is what happened? How did things turn so bad so fast? And how much blame for this war do you pin on President Trump?
Going to start with the easy questions, right, Andrew? I mean,
We got
I
to cut to
don't
the
know.
chase
I
here.
mean,
Yeah.
that's that's the short answer. I do have no idea what is going on in the mind of Donald Trump, and we've had so many mixed messages since this started on Friday. I mean, we've had reports that Trump has known all along about the plans to strike, that he might have even enabled this by luring the Iranians into a state in which they thought talks were ongoing and that there was no immediate threat from Israel. I'd rather not go there and not believe in that. But as the course of the weekend went on, Trump was taking increasing credit for what was happening. He seemed to really draw energy from this idea or claim that like he was taken by surprise. Donald Trump does not want to be seen as someone who has been tooled around or taken advantage of or abused. So the more that that had been suggested across social media that Netanyahu played him, the more he came out and said, no, I knew all about this. I knew the exact date that this was going to happen. This culminated in an interview that he gave with the Atlantic, in which he said he coined America first, and he gets to define what America first is. And if he defines it as going in and fighting Iran alongside Israel, then so be it. So I think even the tenor and the tone of the responses that he was seeing, particularly in MAGA world, uh, were actually giving fuel to this fire that um, that he knew about these attacks all along, and he absolutely supported them, which is not good for the restrainers. As we've been reporting all along, there is this real divide within the movement over whether or not the Trump administration should pursue a foreign policy of national interest, and whether or not it is in the national interest to support Israel in all of its wars of choice in the region. And this is not good news for us if Trump is going to knee jerk respond to social media attacks or criticisms in a way that puts him in a corner, paints him in the corner uh, as an intervener. And that seems to be what's happening today. I hope I'm ultimately wrong, honestly.
Samantra, what are your thoughts on why this went wrong, when it went wrong? And I'd be curious also to hear your thoughts on what Kelly mentioned. People have been saying there was some sort of deception campaign. Trump was engaged in some sort of ruse to create this element of surprise. Coordinating with Bibi before the Friday attack. What are your thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, so I agree with Kelly. I think we are hearing a lot of mixed messages coming from the administration and from outside as well. I mean, I my thoughts I categorize in 3 points. First of all, I doubt that Trump was part of a deception campaign. His personal animosity about Bibi is pretty well known. If he knew that he was being taken for a ride, he probably wouldn't have, agreed to it. Now, there are instances where we are hearing that he knew about the attack on Iran. Well, that doesn't really say much as to when he got to know and how much. I mean, what we can guess from the operational, stuff that we can see is the U.S. didn't have a leave base issue notice, in place within even 24 hours before. So yeah, it was voluntarily. If you want to leave base and come back to the United States, that's fine. But there is no actual, an order from the U.S. government. These are the kind of things that shows that the U.S. government was kind of surprised at the timing of the attack. The original Israeli idea was like it was they got a green light from the U.S. government, but that eventually changed, saying that yeah, we didn't get a green light, but we had a conversation. And it was like 61st days. I think what Kelly mentioned is important. Uh, Trump likes to win. That's his one single, instinct. He saw this Israeli. I mean, you remember when Ukraine, bombed the strategic bomber fleet of Russia. Trump's first instinct was like, yeah, that was a pretty, badass thing to do. So he kind of like likes the optics of that kind of stuff that happens. And given the Israeli surprise attack on Iran, it took him by surprise. But obviously, he had to say in public that he was aware of it, because he can't say like, no, I actually didn't know anything about it, and I was taken for a ride. So some of that is, instinctive, but also basically he's still opposed to expansion of the conflict. Like recently, this news came out that the Israelis wanted the U.S. administration to join in targeting Fordo, and the U.S. administration declined. Now that is not an operational decision that would be taken by Pentagon alone. That would be taken at the highest echelons of the U.S. government. So by logic, it is implied that Trump knew and opposed an expansion of the conflict. Second, there was news. Obviously, again, it's a a fog of war. But there were news that the Israelis had operational direct link in targeting Ali Khamenei, their the supreme leader. And apparently, the U.S. government said that no, we don't want to target the supreme leader because we want to still continue talking with them. So this shows that on one hand, Trump is trying, or at least Trump administration is trying to sort of like show that they are still in control of this thing, that they are the drivers of this conflict, that they are the senior partners in this conflict between Israel and Iran, even if that's not true. But on the other hand, it also shows that their fundamental instinct is like, no, we still want to have a deal. The problem, however, is sometimes you don't get to decide some of these issues. Like you cannot say today that yeah, sorry, the Israelis are bombing the Iranians, but we want the Iranians to come and have a deal with us. Well, there is one of the most replicable thing in international studies is the rally around the flag effect. Like that is one of the things that happens in regardless of which century you're in or which time period, or whether you're an empire or a nation state. That is one thing that is common, and the Iranians are having a rally around the flag effect because of the Israeli attack. The If Trump would have said that we want to have a personal detente with both Iran and Russia, and we don't really care about Israel or Ukraine, that is a different thing. But what he's trying to say is like we are the peacemakers, and we are trying to bring Israel and Iran to talk, or we are trying to bring Ukraine and Russia to talk. That is difficult to do when the combatants in this case, or the parties to the combat, are not willing to do that. You cannot force two wild bulls to stop, heading each other in a jungle. That is not, in your remit. What you can do is individually get out of the conflict and say, like, by the way, we don't have any problem. We're not going to take part in this. We're not going to take part with Iran and a conflict with Iran. We're not going to take part in a conflict with Russia. Good luck to both of you. We are out. But Trump is trying to kind of like try and juggle both of these instincts at the same time, and I think that is creating a problem. A final thought: we have mentioned this before, and we are hearing this constantly, that this was a preemptive strike. A preemptive strike, by definition, means that Israel had some kind of knowledge about an immediate strike on Israeli interests. So far, we have seen no evidence of that. In fact, what has happened is the conflict now has morphed to a decapitation or a regime change operation. That, by definition, is not a preemptive strike. And we kind of like, I mean, that also kind of shows that the Americans were not prepared because they had no idea that Israel was going to do that.
Yeah, let me say I share your skepticism about this idea of this deception campaign that Trump and Bibi were coordinating. If you go read the articles that have the headlines about how Trump and Bibi had this deception campaign, I mean, the evidence is remarkably weak. It seems to me like what happened is Trump made some comments that were interpreted as a kind of yellow light. Like he expressed that maybe Israel is going to do this, like they're gearing up to do something clearly. And Israel kind of interpreted it as a green light. And then officials, because originally the story came to Axios from Israeli officials as the sources, they told Axios, oh, yeah, Trump and Bibi, this was all a ruse. The rift between them was all a ruse. And I think assuming that was a lie, assuming that there was no ruse, there was a real rift, Trump really was trying to prevent an Israeli attack, you could see a lot of advantages that Israel would gain from leaking that. One, it does give Trump a kind of way to save face, as Sumantra was just talking about. It also makes Iran much more wary of, resuming negotiations with the United States because now it thinks, wait, we were being fooled this entire time. So it serves the strategic interests of Israel to lie about it, and they know that Trump will be tempted to say, "Oh yeah, that's true. It was all a ruse. I was conducting myself in this strong and impressive way, like I'm a strategist." Um, so at the same time, I'm not ruling out that there was a deception campaign. I mean, if you look at the chain of events, you know, it's clear we anticipated some strikes before they happened. We were repositioning our warships in the Mediterranean Sea in preparation to, help with Israel's air defense to take out missiles and drones. We did encourage military dependents to leave the region, and we withdrew non-essential ambassadorial staff from the region as well. Although, as Sumatra mentioned, we didn't do that as far in advance and in as formal a way as we would have if they knew for sure a war was going to be breaking out, like between Iran and Israel. So that's my take on that. I'm skeptical, but I don't rule it out. And I mentioned the issue of negotiations. We were supposed to have meetings in Oman yesterday between U.S. and Iran. Trump is still portraying Israeli strikes as almost as if they're like ramping up pressure on Iran to resume negotiations, like it's part of some negotiating strategy. His Truth Social post indicates that he's kind of thinking of it that way. Kelly, do you think that there is any chance that Iran's going to actually come to the negotiation table and talk about ending the war and about the nuclear deal, like at this point?
I mean, that really sounds like a cope from the president. I mean, my boss Trita Parsi holds out like a sliver of hope that there can be negotiations at some point. But just talking with you both here, I realize how Israel has just set our diplomatic strategy on fire, because what they did is it's twofold. Either the president was duped, he didn't know anything about it, they took advantage of him, and so he looks weak. And why would Iran want to deal with a weak partner in these talks? Can't trust them. Or Trump actually, engaged in a ruse to lull them into this surprise attack, and so they still can't be trusted. So either way, they're screwed. And then if Israel is leaking, or at least proliferating, this idea that it was a ruse, They've shot that through the bloodstream of social media, so that's got them on edge. Um, we continue to fuel the conflict with our weapons. Now we're seeing all these reports about refueling. I'm with you, Sumatra. I don't know. There's so many mixed messages. A lot of things haven't been confirmed, but there's a lot of noise out there about our refueling, our assistance with knocking down missiles and drones throughout the Middle East. So we are part of the conflict. Are we in a defensive mode now? Yes. Are we not yet in offensive? Yes. But still, how does Iran go back to the table knowing that we are part and parcel of this attack, whether it be our weapons and munitions, as well as our assistance in missile defense and refueling, and who knows, maybe intelligence as well. So I don't see how they get back on track at this moment. And I'd love to hear Sumatra's uh, opinions on this, but how does this affect the talks in Ukraine with Russia in terms of the optics of not being able to be trusted, um, not having the agency, which that's what kind of looks like with the Trump administration. What we tell Putin one day, is it going to be overcome by events the next? Can we be trusted? And I have a feeling this is going to have quite a domino effect on our other, pathways that of peace. We have a president who promised to end the war in Ukraine and get a deal with Iran, and it doesn't. I'm sorry, but this doesn't seem to bode very well. And I think this is what Israel had in mind all along.
Yeah, before I kick it to you so much, I want to say as far as how all of this can affect the Russia-Ukraine talks, just somewhat minor, but I think important point. I'm sure Russia noticed that one of the special operations that Israel conducted from inside Iran looked a lot like the special op that Ukraine conducted inside Russia. Israel had these drones inside some sort of container. I don't know. Ukrainians did this inside of a truck and parked it near an airfield, released it, and then they were steered, against these jets, including some strategic bombers. Israel did the very similar thing. I don't know if they were inspired by Ukraine, but I wouldn't be surprised if Russia thinks, okay, this takes a lot of planning over a long period of time. These are both, you know, partners, clients of the United States. How involved was it exactly in this attack? But Sumatra, I'd be curious about your thoughts on that. And are we gonna? Is there any chance we'll have U.S. Iran talks again, given the state of things now? And also, Kelly mentioned this offensive defensive aid distinction. I'd be curious to hear what you think about that, Sumatra.
Yeah, look, I mean, part of the reason why MAGA world is so divided is because it's there is a rhetorical debate that's going on about the sophistry of the word, what conflict entails in this context. Is American forces are is America a co-belligerent of Israel? Technically, per international law, yes. If we are refueling their jets, and if Germany and Britain, which is that their planes are Germans are so incompetent when it comes to flying refueling jets that they forgot to like turn off the transponder and it was like on top of like Iraq. Clearly, that was like fueling some Israeli jets because the Israeli jets don't really have that much amount of capability to go deep into Iran and strike. So clearly, some Western countries, by all means, like Germany, France, Germany, Britain, and the United States, are in some ways co-belligerent. There are exo-atmospheric interceptions of Iranian ballistic missiles. Only Americans can do that. So that, clearly, like, we are partly, taking part in this conflict. That being said, again, by definition, as long as you're not taking part in offensive operations, for example, if you're shooting down Iranian missiles on top of the Red Sea, yes, you are doing it, but also you can logically say that it's on top of like international, waters, and we are doing that, yada yada. On the other hand, if you're actually actively suppressing the Iranian missiles from their position of launch, then that is a far more offensive, category. I don't. I mean, yes, technically, the military historian would argue on these things, and I can, argue on both sides of, if I, regardless of who I want to support. But yes, there is no question that we are helping Israel in this conflict. I mean, that if someone denies that, that is just wrong in my opinion. The second point is whether the Iranians are going to trust us anymore. Well, two things can happen, depending, and we don't know the answer to the question. Whether the Iranians can trust the fact that the Israelis are client states that Americans can control, I don't think so. I think both the Russians and the Iranians, and pretty much all the adversarial powers, China, North Korea, you name it, even neutral powers like India, for example, they're going to take this lesson from this conflict that basically the Americans don't really control their client states. They cannot. Uh, Israel technically is currently in a conflict over Gaza, with Yemen, over Hezbollah in Lebanon, with Iran, and potentially in South Sudan. If the South Sudanese operate on Israeli interest. Clearly, not all of those things are aided by the Americans, but the Americans are also not capable of stopping it from happening. The idea of client state comes into play when both sides work. Like you can use them as attack dogs against something, and simultaneously you can actually stop them from doing something. So far we have seen no evidence the Americans are capable of stopping either Ukraine or the Israelis. In fact, you can see a lot of similarity, as you mentioned, operational tactics wise. Ukraine and Israel are using the same. I think the Ukrainian one was a lot more sophisticated, given it was Russia, and it went so far in to strike in Russian bases, and all the satellite dynamics that comes into play, tracking a Russian mobile fleet. I think the Israeli one operation was a little bit more primitive in some ways, because Israeli agents are already inside Iran. Iran is a porous society. They're not really their counterintelligence is not really that good, but nevertheless they are very similar in some ways. Rhetorically, the Ukrainians and the Israelis are both saying, like, if it's Tel Aviv first and then it's New York. The Ukrainians say the exact same thing. It's Kiev and then it's going to be Poland and then it's NATO. So rhetorically, it's very similar. They're trying to kind of like show both sides that it's kind of like a one global war that you're already part of, so that it's creating that kind of rhetorical, the narrative, informational hegemony, as we call it, that you cannot get out of that system. Like, everyone knows that, oh, we are already in a war. What else can happen anyway? So it's creating all that narrative hegemony. But basically, we are in no position to control either Ukraine or Israel. I mean, that is one of the things which I've been selling for the last, I don't know, a year. That, like, the easiest way to have an America First foreign policy is to just wash your hands. You cannot control either client states, and you definitely cannot control the adversarial regimes. The best way of what you can do is let a natural equilibrium fall into place. Like, if countries want to fight each other, great, let them do that. That is a good America First policy. You don't have to stop Israel. You don't have to stop Ukraine, but you also don't really have to support them. You can't just like say that this is not our conflict, and that is pretty much what the president was saying. But obviously, this happened, and he can't back out of it because he can't say that I was duped. And the final point of this thing is, at the end of the day, if you are an adversarial power of the United States, and if you're trying to have like a track to diplomacy, what guarantee is there tomorrow that you're not going to back off? That America is not going to back off from any promises that he made. Tomorrow, for example, if the Iranians take the lesson of Gaddafi and say that, by the way, we are wishing off all our nuclear program, maybe the Israelis would want to have a regime change in Iran tomorrow. And there is no guarantee that they are not going to pursue a regime change in Iran tomorrow. And there is no guarantee that Americans are not going to pursue. There might be a different administration. There might be a Ron DeSantis administration, after this, who might be far more hawkish on Iran, regardless of whether Iranians have a missile defense program or a nuclear program or not. So the Republican instinctive hawkishness is still there, and that hasn't gone away. So I think if I was an adversarial power, I would imagine that if I am, by the way, conventionally weaker than both America and Israel, my ultimate instinct would be to go for the nuclear weapons program. It's the ultimate leveler. Like, look at North Korea. We're not going to go to war with North Korea because it has got 15 nuclear weapons, and it can destroy Seoul, and it can destroy New York and Guam and Hawaii. So at the end of the day, if our instinct was to stop Iranians rushing towards nuclear weapons, I think this would have the exact opposite effect because at this point of time, they've got nothing to lose.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts in response to what you were saying. I think you made some very insightful points. I disagreed with your way of putting a couple things, but first I'm going to throw it to Kelly because I'm sure you were also having thoughts in response. So I just want to hear generally what your take is, but also Sumantra was talking a lot about the U.S.-Israel relationship and our apparent difficulties controlling this client, and I'm just curious if you like what you think Trump could have done vis-a-vis Israel to prevent this war or to stop it now.
Well, he could have told him to back off and stop. I feel, I mean, and that might be too simplistic of a response, Andrew, but I do feel like, we demanded, I mean, we saying people in the restraint community demanded that Biden man up and stand up to Netanyahu through all of the years of what we saw, the destruction of Gaza with U.S. munitions and bombs, and call for humanitarian aid, use the leverage, the $4 billion a year and leverage, and Biden didn't do it. And I'm demanding the same from Trump. He has the leverage, he just doesn't use it. I don't know what kind of pressures his administration is under on the inside. I know there was a lot of hope that some restrainers, people, some realists have gotten into the administration, that they could persuade him, including people right at the top like J.D. Vance and Tulsi Gabbard, to persuade him to take another path. And then he would come out and say, I don't want to go to war with Iran. I am encouraging them to go to the table. I'm encouraging them to make a deal. Steve Witkoff is out there basically saying the same thing. And then all of a sudden we had this argument over whether or not they should have the right to a civilian enrichment program. And then it seemed like it all fell apart. And so I don't know what kind of pressures he's under with Netanyahu and his government, but he didn't seem to go the last mile in terms of preventing this. And that's all I'm going to say about that because I don't have any inside information. What really terrifies me is that this ramp up of rhetoric by the neoconservatives today. I listened to somebody on one of the Sunday shows, and I'm afraid I don't have the name because I was listening to it on the radio as C-SPAN was replaying, I think, Fox News Sunday. And here was a guy who was an ambassador, wasn't Huckabee, who's the ambassador to Israel today, saying that we have to prevent the next Hitler, that every day, but the bullets wake up and they say they want to destroy the United States. I mean, this is pure delusion, but they're pulling out all the stops from 2001, 2002, 2003 in the run up to the Iraq war, saying that this is our war, that Iran is an existential threat to us, their nuclear program, their nuclear weapons that do not exist at this time, and that our own intelligence tells us does not exist, and that they do not have the program to build a nuclear weapon, and nor do they want one. Our own U.S. intelligence is telling us this. And there are people inside the Trump administration and in the influence sphere, or whatever you want to call it, who want to deny that and want us to believe that we are an imminent threat. What I'm afraid of is that one of these attacks from an Iran-backed militia in Iraq that have already started or had continued to attack our forces that are stationed there is going to be the trigger for Trump, who wants to look tough, to turn around and say, see, they're attacking us now. We have to fight. We have to join our Israeli partners in eliminating this threat. And it's going to take just a trigger, I'm afraid, for us to enjoin Israel and concede to Netanyahu's demands for a bunker busting bomb. And I agree with Trita Parsi, my boss at Quincy, who suggested that Israel doesn't feel like it can do this alone. This is not going to be a cakewalk for them. And they realize early on, after Friday's first attack and the Iranian response, that they need us. And that is the only reason they were already knocking on our door on Saturday for these bunker busting bombs. And I feel like Trump is right on the edge, and all he needs is a reason to get us into this war. And honestly, within the company of you both, As somebody who has been fighting against war since I started my journalism career many, many years ago, that is going to be one hell of a depressing moment for all of us who have seen some sort of progress in the restraint movement over the last year with this administration.
Yeah, before I kick it to you, Sumatra, I saw you had your hand raised. I just wanted to point out two other things that are happening or that could happen that are going to put a lot of pressure on Trump to intervene in a more direct way. You mentioned the prospect of our own forces or assets being targeted by Iran. And again, they are involved in the conflict. I mean, for decades, we've been supplying Israel's military and bankrolling its military and creating this moral hazard where it knows it won't pay the consequences if it launches a war because we're going to provide our superpower shield afterwards. And then in this specific conflict, as I mentioned, we've repositioned our forces and we're very much engaged in air defense on Israel's behalf. And so Iran might come to see those as legitimate targets, and it might come to see those as an opportunity to ramp up pressure on the US in a bid to get us to pull out. Two other things I'm worried about, two kind of chains of events that Israel has set in motion by attacking Iran are one, it seems very likely to me now that Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapon. Like, I don't know why they wouldn't. I don't think they were before. Tulsi Gabbard presented intel to Congress, just a few months ago saying, nope, same as always. We don't assess that they're pursuing a nuclear weapon. They keep their enrichment at near weapons grade. They're kind of like a threshold nuclear state because it's like a form of leverage. And if they're attacked, they could potentially pursue a nuclear weapon. Well, I think that they surely must be doing so now because they're going to conclude that they absolutely need a nuclear deterrent. So if those, you know, uh, centrifuges at the Fordo site aren't knocked out, which they're not, they might be ramping up activity there and pursuing a bomb. And there's going to be a lot of pressure on Trump, and there already is a ton of pressure on Trump. I mean, go read the Wall Street Journal editorial board today saying the Fordo initiative or something like that, like the mandate. I can't remember what word they use. Like Trump has to take out Fordo. The other thing, and the thing that kind of worries me the most, I think, is that Israel has good air defenses, but there's a certain like fail rate of their air defenses, and these ballistic missiles by Iran are getting in, and as the ratio changes, as the fail rate changes, it's probably going to do so in a way that's worse for Israel. I mean, maybe not because Israel is also targeting Iran in like a strategic way to try to take out their missile launchers and stuff, but Iran is also hitting some of uh, these air defense batteries in Israel, and we don't know exactly how many interceptors Israel have. Those are the missiles that hit the missiles, but we know that the West collectively does not produce a lot of them, including the U.S. And Iran probably has thousands of ballistic missiles and is probably making between like 50 to 100 every month. So we could get to a situation where Israel, a nuclear armed state, has ballistic missiles raining down on it. It's a small country. I mean, it can't have all of its major cities being totally obliterated by ballistic missiles. Like every barrage seems to be escalating on both sides. That's just the logic of violence. And I think the US and Trump might feel pressure to intervene just to prevent Israel from attacking Iran with a nuclear weapon. I mean, Israel does have a public military doctrine called the Samson option. If you know the story of Samson, you can kind of imagine what it is. It's not quite as radical a doctrine as people sometimes make it seem. It's not like they're going to nuke the entire world, but they do have a doctrine where they will respond with massive nuclear force if they're under attack, including in the way that I was just describing. So, Mantra, I'll just kick it with you. I don't have a question, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, to somewhat alleviate Kelly's, worry. There, Trump is on the line. There is no question about it. He's on the edge. He can fall either way. He's also, not to be too cocky about it, but there are ways to make Trump do things. If you have to appeal to his, goodwill, you have to appeal to his ego, to his, PR and all that kind of stuff. So the Israelis, if they're smart, they'll be able to appeal to those instincts and can get Trump's way on either way. Clearly, they are quite successful so far. That being said, there are also in Trump's immediate inner circle people who are pretty sympathetic to Restraint, and part of the reason we haven't seen if it was any other administration, whether it was a Biden administration or Kamala Harris's, administration, or Ron DeSantis, we probably would have seen a lot more, aggressive U.S. response. So it's not all, cloudy. There are certain silver linings as well. Fingers crossed, that's going to continue. Um, the second question is, look, at the end of the day, the idea of destroying Iranian nuclear option is militarily nonsensical because it's not going to happen. Fordo is a classic example. It's buried deep, deep, deep inside. Even if the Americans use bunker busters, and even if they destroy us, Iran is a country which is 3 times the size of Iraq, surrounded by mountains, with 80 million people. They can remake Fordo much deeper if they want to. And the only way to stop that are, one, either through invasion, in which case you are installing a foreign government, or through regime change through inside, like you are, supporting some kind of coup or some kind of color revolution. The problem in both of those options are, one, there is no American appetite, regardless of how many times the Israelis want to push the Americans to go to war. At the end of it, there is no American appetite to actually go for an invasion in Middle East, and go to Iran and kind of like face a conflict, a war with 80 million people who by now are heavily hostile to us. And the second problem is, the color revolution idea was always fanciful. 20,000 people marching in Tehran doesn't mean that Iran is a very liberal society and it's going to turn to Switzerland tomorrow. Same thing with Iraq. Like said, that we make the same mistake thinking like, oh, there are people marching in Moscow. That means Russia is going to be it's going to be a liberal, ally. But that has never been the case. Majority of the people who are in deep hinterland, they support their government. That's why the government has some kind of staying power, and they have entrenched interests when it comes to their bureaucracy, when it comes to their military. And most interestingly, if you talk to the Iranian, or if you listen to the Iranian military researchers or historians, or people, they constantly mention that, by the way, we have the capability of reaching nuclear weapons stage. The only reason we are not doing it because our supreme leader doesn't want us to do. Our supreme leader doesn't want us to go for the bomb because he thinks that that's not a good thing. That's not something we need. If tomorrow, God forbid, there is a decapitation, in Iran, and there is a toppling of the supreme leader, we might see a lot more hardliners come into power. The calculation is like, always, the moment you topple a central authority, you get something that you always want. That has historically never been the case in Middle East. It wasn't there in Libya. It wasn't there in Syria. It wasn't there in Iraq. It's not going to be there in Iran. In fact, it's definitely not going to be there in Iran because Iran has been historically an adversarial power. Um, so whenever I hear these kind of things that tomorrow, what would happen between Iranian and American relations, the only thing that is important in this calculation is how much stable the regime is. And at this point of time, the more we encourage a conflict with the regime, the more we are hardening the internal coherence of the regime. Like, it's having the exact opposite effect of, like, think of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed because the people living inside the Soviet Union saw that their regime was bad. They couldn't provide stuff. If we were constantly in conflict with them, that wouldn't have happened. They would have rallied around their flag. The 50s was different than the 1970s and 1980s. We were not in conflict with the Soviet Union with the 1980s. We looked at our own social stuff. We looked at our own computers and internets and all the kind of technological revolution that was happening, benefiting the lifestyle of the people inside. It was leading by example, and that led to the collapse of Soviet Union. And Soviet Union obviously, like, overstretched in Afghanistan because it didn't have the social, it was having various different countries inside one entity, and obviously that couldn't continue. The Iranians are not like that. It's a country which is not constantly. I mean, their client states there have collapsed in Gaza and in Lebanon, but they are still in power. It's not a complete decimation of Hezbollah or Hamas. The Houthis are still in power. The Iranians have got options to counter escalate against us. And as you rightly mentioned, if this thing continues, If if the Israelis hit Iranians or the Iranians hit Israelis, at some point in time, there would be a rally like, look, this is not happening. We have to intervene. And my problem to that phase is like, intervene in what way? Because we don't want to do a regime toppling. We don't want to do an intervention in Iran. We don't want to have kind of like a color revolution. That's not going to happen anyway. What is the point of hitting their weapons program, because they can reconstitute that? So it's pessimistic. I mean, I'm not sounding. There is no optimism in my voice because there is nothing to say. This is a foolish strategy. We are essentially hardening the Iranian internal coherence of society, where they are, whichever, I mean, even the liberals, there are social media, where people without a hijab is coming and saying like, yeah, we need to go for the bomb now because we are being. That is what happens if you destroy the residential areas of Tehran. I see. There was. I want to finish with one simple anecdote. I was in a taxi in DC, and my taxi driver was a lawyer from Iraq. And I looked at that guy, and he was working as a bureaucrat in his own country, and it reminded me of my own father. My father was a senior legal bureaucrat at some point in time. Imagine if I was in a country which was being destroyed, if my father lost his job and had to drive a taxi in a different country, how would I feel? These are the kind of things that people don't realize. The Iranians, most of the people are middle class. They're seeing their buildings being destroyed. They're seeing they're losing the object. For what? It's hardening their society in a permanent adversarial relation with the United States, and that is not to the benefit of us.
Yeah, Sumatra, I like how you began those remarks by saying you're going to give Kelly some reason for optimism, and then you just got more pessimistic as you went, and then eventually said, "I'm very pessimistic now." I'll say one thing, and then I'll give you the last word, Kelly. So, Sumatra, you mentioned, what would intervention accomplish? Because we don't want regime change war, but we don't want a regime change war, but. Mark Dubovitz of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies wants that. Mark Levin, Fox News host, wants that. Rupert Murdoch, media mogul, he definitely wants that. JD Vance went to his ranch in Montana this past week. I'm sure he got a lecture on the importance of standing with Israel. The Wall Street editorial board, relatedly, wants that. There's a lot of pressure to do that, and I predict that's what will happen. I mean, maybe I'll be wrong. I hope I'm going to be wrong, but I'll just say it now. I predict we are heading, like, I can't think, when I game it out in my head, it doesn't lead to anywhere else except us intervening to help topple the Iranian regime. Because diplomacy I mean, I hope Trita Parsi is right. He knows a lot more about this than I do. So that gives me some reason for optimism. There may be hope for negotiation to kind of wind this thing down. But that's not my prediction. Sorry to throw it to you on such a somber note, Kelly. Sumatra, to his credit, when he was giving reason for optimism, he mentioned that there are restrainers like in the MAGA movement in the White House. So maybe you can talk about that. What do you think is the future of conservative restrainers, both in the upper echelons and at the base?
Yeah, and before I do, I just want to point out what a maniac Benjamin Netanyahu has, because as we've been talking, and it's 1 o'clock on Monday afternoon, he's giving his remarks, and he says, if the U.S. helps Israel assassinate Iran's supreme leader, it will, quote, help end the conflict and makes the Middle East great again. So no incremental steps from the Israelis. They're going right to regime change and right to the head, just like they've been, you know, perpetuating these memes all weekend showing a snake's head getting slammed by Israeli fists. So we know where they would like the Trump administration to go, loud and clear. But I would like to end on some optimism, because after having toiled away in Washington throughout the Iraq War, Afghanistan, and amidst the blob, the foreign policy establishment, I have not seen a resistance against U.S. empire as strong and as vocal and as effective as the center right restraint movement in the last, I want to say, 10 years. And it is strong. And it's not just pegged on one man, Trump. Right now, he is the vessel through which we can get restraint and change the course of foreign policy. But it's more than one man. And I have been heartened to see Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene gave a ripper of a X post overnight about restraint and how it was not our fight there or in Ukraine, and how she doesn't want to see anybody bombed, and much less with our weapons, that we have work to do in our own country. And she's vocalizing all of the common sense that the American people have been embracing, since the end of our forever wars. And yes, it's a right wing conservative from MAGA who's doing it. And it's a lot of people from MAGA that are putting themselves out there to criticize Israel, which unfortunately the Democrats under Biden just couldn't do. Whether it be their control by APAC or their concern of looking weak when it comes to Iran, they just couldn't really influence the Biden administration from, a position of strength. And I feel like MAGA is the very center of Trump's power. He wouldn't be here without MAGA. And so to have a split in MAGA this vocal, and have people like Charlie Kirk out there warning against getting involved in an intervention. And then you combine that with MTG and Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon, and that's pretty powerful. This is not to say that Mark Levin doesn't have an audience, and Dubowitz and FDD and Ben Shapiro, but I'm sensing a real shift. And I just hope that these voices remain strong and clear, and that they can get Trump's ear, because I do think, as you both have pointed out, that he is easily influenced in one direction or the other. And I want him to be paying attention to the right people.
I do want to add just one single thing. Trump himself understands that he came to power by promising no war. I think his fundamental instinct is still that this is not our job, this is not our conflict. Whether that's going to continue or whether he's going to be influenced in other way is an open question. But if that prevails, that is a good thing. If Trump basically understands that at the end of the day, this is not our fight, that's something which we can hope for, and hopefully the people around him would be able to steer him towards that.
Yeah, and if we're right that these reports of this ruse or deception campaign are overblown, then presumably Trump is feeling pretty pissed off because he put a lot of administration resources and time into those negotiations that have now been seemingly scuttled. So we'll see how he responds to that. But that brings us to the end of today's episode. I want to thank our listeners and remind our listeners on podcast apps that you can also watch video versions of these episodes on YouTube. And I want to thank you, Kelly Vlahos, and you, Sumantra Mehta, for the excellent and illuminating discussion. See you next time.